between what Bishop Zavala spoke about in the prison system in California through what each person presented, ultimately ending with this concept of globalization. And it really goes back to Kathy's definition at the beginning. We're talking about a clash between forces that move toward order and forces that resist that order and move toward what I would define as empowerment. We've often heard the expression, think globally, act locally. But I would amend that these days to say that the global is the local and the local is the global. And so when we think in terms of forces trying to reassert order, whether it be John Ashcroft and the administration in light of September 11th, which, by the way, was a pretext, the laundry list, I think you'd agree, of expanded powers that the Justice Department was seeking was a laundry list they had prepared long before September 11th. Similarly, the attack on Iraq was prepared and sought years before anything happened on September 11th. But the commonality is exercising more power, more control, more order, versus those forces, whether they be violent and irrational, as we saw manifest on September 11th, or whether they be positive and empowering, as we see in the terms of communities around the world and in this country who are trying to exercise more autonomy, control over themselves. It's the same clash. The context that this is all being played out in today is something we refer to as globalization. And globalization, I always take pains to point out, it's not something you can be for or against. It simply is. What we're for or against is the type of globalization that's being played out. The policies that are trying to guide that globalization process. And right now, those policies are rooted in a particular philosophy of neoliberal economics backed by military force, meaning free markets and freedom to preserve our way of life. And we exercise that freedom through the barrel of a gun. Ultimately, globalization is an industrialization of the global South. One of the scariest things I think I've ever seen, one of the little glimpses behind the curtain, so to say, was a memo that was circulating around the internet about 4 years ago. And it was from Larry Summers, who was then Secretary of the Treasury for the United States under Clinton. And it was a memo that came out of a meeting of elites in Washington who were talking about a strategy. And it was Summers' memo to these folks where he was talking about how they had identified a deficit of pollution in the global South. There wasn't enough pollution in the global South. It was in a deficit. And so what they were crafting were policies that would move the dirtiest industries, the most poisonous industries, from the north to the south. Obviously, if we're not doing our best to pollute the South, we need to do a better job, right? But just that mindset, and it was devoid of any humanity. It was simply looking at what was out there and how can we best capitalize on that to our own benefit. And I would point out to our very short-term benefit, since these forces still don't recognize that what happens in the global South has as much of an impact on us here in the North. But that process of globalization, of an economic model of supposed free trade and democracy, is what the meta-narrative is that's being written out there that we get from Fox News and the administration, and is promulgated through I think it's an average of 180 TV channels that most Americans have access to, none of which are giving any information, but they are reinforcing this narrative. The idea that we have a way of life that is supposedly better than other ways of life, and that this way of life is now, in the post-September 11th moment, in a clash with other forces who would be promulgating another way of life, and that we need to do everything that is at our disposal militarily and economically in order to preserve our way of life, because it's a zero-sum game. Either our way of life is going to win or their way of life is going to win. That's the meta-narrative. That's the context. That's the way it's presented to us. But the reality is that it's the same old story of those who would impose order for their own benefit, as opposed to those who would seek greater autonomy for the expression of their own lives and their own ways of life. Now, when we look back and we see what we've listened to this morning, the thread that runs through it for me is a gospel imperative. I believe that we are at a kairos moment, that Christians and people of faith need to make a choice. Which narrative are we going to give our allegiance to? We're told in the Gospels to visit the prisoner. And so we listen to Bishop Zavala's very compelling stories of the human degradation in our prison system. But what occurs to me as well is that when we're told to visit the prisoner, it's not simply an act of compassion that would bring a benefit to the person we're visiting in the prison, but more importantly, it's an opportunity for our own eyes to be opened and for a transformation to occur in ourselves. Because in reality, we are in the prison. We are a prisoner of that meta-narrative. We are a prisoner of the hype that is built around us. And the only way to break through those prison bars is by the very human act of visitation, of experiencing what the other is experiencing, and having our eyes opened to their experience, and ideally to our own role in that experience. How are we perpetuating that circumstance? Through our own blindness. As we move through, we see that when we speak in terms of the civil liberties that are being taken away from us in this country, and I think what needs to be even more explicit is that, for the most part, to this point, the civil liberties, the vast victims of the Patriot Act are all non-U.S. citizens of any stripe, including legal residents, who have essentially had... America stood apart from every nation in that in our Constitution it says all persons residing in the United States shall have these rights. Not all citizens. We were unique in the sense that the American dream was about providing a level of moral life relative to law and civil society and civic society that extended to anyone here. And that has been abandoned by this administration. Most folks don't connect with this yet. It's that old story about, they came for first they came for the Jews, and then they came for the Catholics, and then they came for the socialists, and then finally came for me. The way that we get past that is by